Fred, thank you for being here. We've had to sub you in for Indra, and Indra unfortunately has come down with a bit of a cough overnight, and so we've had a bit of a chat this morning and said, look, best if you just rest up. We've got her doing a reasonably big thing tomorrow as well, and Fred, we've asked you to sub in, so thank you for doing that. Have you had to sub in before?
I have. So I have had to do this once or twice before, filling other people's shoes. Thankfully, I don't look good in heels, so I won't be wearing Indra's heels. I'll be in flats. And under President Clinton, I was the number 2 person at the Small Business Administration, and our head of the agency was a woman named Aida Alvarez. And one day I had to sub in for Aida, and I remember getting on stage and saying, well, I've had to play many roles. I just never thought I'd ever get a chance to play Aida. So today I will play Indra.
Good on you. Well, it's a real pleasure to have you here. And for those who don't know Fred or haven't seen his bio, we are really lucky to have him with us. He's been part of a delegation that we've come down, which I'll speak about quickly in a minute. 2 decades as an executive, including 5 years as president of the Lillian Vernon Corporation. You then served in various leadership roles at US agencies, non-profit organisations, and in academia. 2009 to 2017, you were chairman and president of the Export-Import Bank of the United States, becoming its longest-serving chairman. And we'll tease out a little bit more about that in a minute. You served as a member of the presidential transition teams in the US of both Bill Clinton and Barack Obama. That will be another interesting topic we can get into. You're the Dean of the Milano School of International Affairs. And amongst other things, in your spare time, you're also the author of a book, Trade is Not a 4-Letter Word, and I'm keen to hear a bit more about that as well. But yesterday, along with 5 other colleagues, including Indra and Seema, who we'll have up in a minute, we also had Alison Britton down from the UK. We've had Tom join us and yourself. We were able to host a number of people and get into a good discussion. And maybe just for the audience here, for many of you who would not have been at that particular event, maybe I'll just share with you some of the highlights of that particular session, which went for a couple of hours. And then we'll jump into some questions. You know, one of the things that became evident as we heard from the panellists yesterday is for a lot of them, they are absolutely a product of their environment, of their parents, of their grandparents, and in some cases, sibling rivalry had a lot to do with how, you know, they individually turned out. And there were comments around, you know, sure, you get a bit of luck in life in terms of where you were born and when you were born, but in a lot of cases it's what you do with that luck and how you turn that into real forward momentum. One of the things that the team did before they arrived in New Zealand is they commissioned quite a bit of research and went out there, used BCG, used some interns, and they were able to share with the group that we had with us yesterday that from their research, which was really from the eyes of younger Kiwis, younger New Zealanders who were studying at universities overseas, who were working in businesses overseas, the way that they described New Zealand, in their view, is that it was a bit like a pie and it was sort of in 3 slices. And there was a slice which is a broad statement, would tend to be people who are a bit wealthier and a bit older, whose view on New Zealand is, heck, this is a really good place to be, and we want to maintain that. We don't really want anyone turning that upside down. Another slice of the pie where a lot of these people that you know, we researched did, or you researched, was we'd really like to see that pie grow. But we're a bit concerned that initial group, they're really not all that interested in growing the pie. They're really a bit more interested in maintaining it. And then there was a comment that there's a third group, often people who possibly are not quite so well off, who are saying, hey, we need a bigger slice of that pie. And that led into what we had then was a pretty interesting discussion around how business can then work with government and government can work with business to come up with a plan. And there was a sharing around what happened, for example, in the state of Connecticut, where a number of years ago the two groups got together, they came up with a clear 10-point plan, they agreed upon it, took them about a year to do it, and then they had been incredibly focused on executing to that plan. And the importance of doing that was really then led into a second key point that came out, that if you don't actually work out how to grow that pie, you're not creating an environment of growth, of oxygen, and what happens after a period of time is you lose your good talent because they want to go somewhere where there is growth and where there is oxygen. So, good discussions around that. We did have a good discussion around India, and I thought there were some really salient points that came out there, and I won't spend a lot of time on it. Suffice to say that from some of the panelists' views, if you want to be in India, then you must participate in India, for India, with India, and you should consider an Indian partner. So in India, for India, with an Indian partner. And Indra was pretty strong about that. Bit of a discussion around China and decoupling, and a comment there that, gee, maybe a dose of reality there. China's going to be an important part of all of us for a long time to come. And a discussion around Warren Buffett and would be prepared to bet against him, and I'll throw a question in your direction in a minute about that. As has already been mentioned, we see that Charlie Munger unfortunately passed away overnight. I thought there was a wonderful quote, actually, of Charlie's that was made a number of years ago that Warren made. He said, Charlie and I went soft last year and added one more person to headquarters. Charlie, bless him, never lets me forget Ben Franklin's advice. A small leak can sink a great ship. So, wonderful quote. Some of the other things that we got into a discussion around, things such as Prince's Trust, which Alison got into, the fact that we need, to fuel the economy with small businesses, encouraging students to go overseas, but bringing them back home. And then, if there was a resounding theme that I thought that came across time and time again, it was around the importance of education, and you've heard some of that come through already today. And that was a theme around so much of the discussion and all the topics, and the importance of the fact that if we have students going overseas and they do work in great businesses and are very successful, how do we then create an environment to get them back into our country? There were a few other points. We did get into a discussion around who would win the presidential election, so it was interesting that Jonathan weighed in on his views. Suffice to say that both you and Tom were of the view that more likely to be Biden. Ambition...
As did the last panel, I heard.
Yes.
60-40.
Yeah, I did note that. And of course, ambition for New Zealand. You spoke about the ability to be able to change and flex, and how you yourself had witnessed the demise of the textile industry in the US, and I saw that myself in my time at Walmart. But the rise of lycra and spandex, and the ability to pivot and come up with something new. Tom spoke about uniqueness, find those points of difference and play on it, and then it all once again came back to education. So just for everyone here, that was just a snapshot of some of the discussion we had yesterday. It was terrific, and I know that everyone valued it. Maybe if we can jump straight into our discussion, and let's pick up where you this book that you wrote. Trade is not a four-letter word. Yes, it does translate well in New Zealand. There's a point in the book around the dollar symbol, and I wouldn't mind you just sharing your thoughts on that.
Sure. Actually, I would tell you, the book was also translated into Korean, and they did not have the equivalent of a four-letter word. It just was like, trade is a bad word, which didn't really sell a lot of books in that title. But a lot of you have a piece of paper in front of you, and you know, the US dollar sign and the New Zealand dollar sign are very similar. So why don't you take out a piece of paper, and what does that look like? Usually it has a giant S with either one or two bars through it. If you've read the book, which I doubt anyone in this room has read the book, what do you think any idea what that stands for?
Does it come from Spain?
It comes exactly from Spain. It comes from the Straits of Gibraltar. Before Columbus set sail for what he thought was India, which is why Native Americans, indigenous population, were called Indians for so long, because he thought he'd actually come to India. There were two pillars by the Straits of Gibraltar that said in Latin, and Tom will correct my pronunciation, nec plus ultra, essentially nothing further beyond, to warn sailors not to go beyond the Straits because you will fall off the earth because it's flat. When Columbus returned, they actually did a little bit of graffiti and scratched out the nothing, nook, and it's just blue ultra, further beyond. And in many ways, that's what really this conference is about, is looking further beyond, looking for those other opportunities, both in trade and in building an economy. So I thought about that when I wrote the book, and I thought about that in sitting in the audience earlier today.
Thank you. Wonderful story, and thanks, Jonathan. You're a wonderful history buff. You chaired the Export-Import Bank for 10 years. Now, I don't think we have one here in New Zealand. So what does it do, and should we actually be looking at something like that, Fred?
So the United States has something called a U.S. Export-Import Bank, which was started by Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1934, with the goal of we needed to create more jobs in America, and one way to create jobs is to do more exporting. So this was founded in 1934. I'll tell you very briefly. It was initially founded to do a sale to Russia. That fell apart. So they recharted it to make it more broader. And the first transaction, interestingly, was to take American silver that we mined in America and made coins and currency at the Philadelphia Mint for Cuba. So we actually provided Cuba with its currency using American silver and American technology. By the way, today the Export-Import Bank and U.S. cannot trade with Cuba, so it's somewhat ironic the first transaction was that way. But what it does is it provides both jobs in the U.S., but importantly, for foreign exports, including agriculture, which is one of the main exports from New Zealand, of financing to countries that perhaps cannot finance those purchases. So when I started the Export-Import Bank in 2009, when President Obama appointed me, there were perhaps 60 of those banks around the world. Today, they're close to 100. So it might be something that the new government in New Zealand might consider as you're trying to further exports. It is a way of sort of making that a more financeable and a safer environment for companies, both large and small. In fact, when I was at the Export-Import Bank, we financed a number of Air New Zealand aircraft that when they purchased Boeing aircraft, we were able to finance those.
Thank you for your support. We're after a few more.
I'll give them a call.
Thank you. It's your first time here in New Zealand. You came in about a week ago. We had a session yesterday. What are some of your perceptions?
Well, I thought about two in particular, besides it being the most magnificent, gorgeous country that adds pounds in weight to any visitor because the food is so spectacular, but I digress. Two things I thought about in particular. One is which we've seen throughout in our stay here, and that is the integration of indigenous people in the main culture of and the political environment in New Zealand. So many other countries, including the United States, have had such a challenge doing this. So I think New Zealand stands really as a shining example of that integration and finding a way that makes it much more cohesive and seamless. It's not, I'm sure it's not without its challenges, and it's not all smooth passing, but I think it's a great example here. And the other thing is, it's very nice not being in the government because I feel somewhat untethered. You have a parliamentary system. We have, in our country, all the disadvantages of a parliamentary system and none of the advantages. So at least you have the advantages of a parliamentary system, and you also have the advantage of having a unicameral system where there's one parliament, one body. We have two bodies that at times act as though we have an opposition party and a party in power and very little common ground. So I actually admire the system you do have here. And I will tell you another quick story. After World War II, when so many countries were trying to redo their constitutions and build a new government structure, and our State Department assisted in many of them, they made sure that no other country followed the model of our system, with an electoral college and 2 senators from every state and so forth and so on. So it's a wonderful system. It works for our country. It's not a one-size-fits-all, that's for sure.
That's a resounding advertisement, which we'll take on board. What advice would you give people about business dealing with government and government dealing with business? Because you've had this wonderful career of doing that. So give us some wisdom.
Well, you know, I think partly they have very different objectives and very different points of view. I'll give you an example. When I was at the Export-Import Bank, and we had meetings, I remember particularly in the White House, about what we were looking for business to do, and this was after the global financial crisis, and many in the White House said, well, we want people to hire more people. We need more jobs. And I go, let me be very clear. I've never met a person in business who says, what I want to do is add more people to payroll. As you told that story about Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger. So partly it's trying, I think both sides need to understand what are the objectives and what are the sort of measures of success. So if you're in business, you're looking to increase sales, looking to increase profitability, and more being important stakeholders, looking at the environment, looking at the community, looking at the longer term. And what government can do is provide that environment for growth. And what business needs to do is to then identify those areas that are needed. The trade minister spoke earlier. We've talked about trade in our country, which is a challenging subject right now. But they're very different objectives. And I think part of the problem is business people often is looking at it purely, and we heard this yesterday at the conference, Accelerate NZ, looking at, well, what does this do for my company? And if you're talking to government leaders, you need to be looking at how does what your company needs fit within the larger scheme of what an administration or government's trying to do, and that might be jobs in that case. And of course, listen, every business leader would like fewer regulations and lower taxes. They'd be crazy not to. However, it's the role of government to find a way to say, okay, within that context, how do we find a common ground because capitalism works really well, but it needs to be, frankly, in some ways tamed. It needs to also pay its fair share in taxes so that the benefits of that economy is spread further than simply the shareholders alone.
So, you know, as you think about it, and in various countries that you've also had to deal with, do you think that the US has a benefit ahead of other countries in terms of how government and business interact? And if so, what is that, and should that be replicated? How did it come about?
Well, you know, one thing, at the opening this morning, the new Prime Minister mentioned his time in America, and you've spent substantial time there. And he said something, and I actually wrote it down. I think that one of the differences is that in the U.S. and the business community, execution is paramount. And I think that it was a change. You know, if you owned stock in an American company during the 1970s, it went nowhere from 1970 to 1979. But frankly, in the 80s, a number of factors: more globalism, more foreign competition. We had a lot of Wall Street raiders, some good, some bad. But my point was execution and delivering. It was no longer a job about stewardship. It was a job about execution and increasing sales and profits. Now, in some ways, I think we may have gone overboard in our country in that regard. But I think that is one thing that does distinguish sort of the U.S. system and why it has flourished so well.
We didn't really get into this yesterday, but I'm quite keen to hear about, you know, your views on TPP and CPTPP. What's your unvarnished thoughts on that?
You know, and I know that free trade is a keen topic here in New Zealand. I will just back up. One of my first trips as chairman of the Export-Import Bank, I went to Brazil, and one of the first subjects was, can we have a free trade agreement with the United States? Now, my job was not in charge of trade agreements. That would have been, United States trade representative, but I said, my personal advice is, no, forget it. It's not going to happen. It took, people forget, in NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, was started by Ronald Reagan, negotiated in full by George Bush, and only got ratified under the Clinton presidency. So many people think of this as a Clinton item when, frankly, it started under 2 Republican administrations. The consensus for trade, and partly why I wrote the book, has largely gone sideways in the United States. Both are more progressive on the liberal side, and the conservative side have not viewed trade as a real plus. Now, part of that problem, I think, in our country is we did not have a sufficient social safety net to take care of people and to find ways for them to get back on their feet and to find those productive jobs again. So we did that to ourselves. We had something, a bill called Trade Adjustment Assistance. It actually was more effective than it's given credit for. But it had very little, we had a lot of, I'll be very partisan, very Republican objection to it. And as a result, I think it gave Americans a bad taste for trade, because the benefits of trade are spread far and wide. The pain can be very narrowly focused. And in our country, it got narrowly focused in a number of key states, places like Ohio, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, and on election night, every presidential year, the states we look at most keenly are Ohio, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan, because they're battleground states. So that issues around trade became razor sharp in those places. So that made TPP, coming back to your question, very difficult. For years, trade deals passed in our Congress through large Republican support. That Republican support somewhat evaporated with Donald Trump and the Republicans in Congress, and so there was really it got hollowed out from within. Secretary Clinton, when she ran for president, was initially a supporter of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP, but particularly in the Democratic Party, the support with senators like Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, really sort of eroded that support for trade, and I don't think we have a really strong consensus right now. I think we have something called, the U.S. government, we have these terrible acronyms, IPEF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. That's a good plan. It's looking at how we harmonize supply chains and trade. It does not provide market access. It does not provide a benefit on tariffs and so forth, but in my opinion, it's the best we can do right now. We should do that, build on that, and maybe at some point we could do some trade deals.
So when you say it's the best we can do right now, does that mean that you think it is the right solution, or it's just the best we can do? And do you have a view? What is your sort of answer first as to what it could be or what it could look like?
Well, politics is the art of what's possible. And right now, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework is what's possible in our country. And that has actually had some headwinds. Even though it does not require congressional approval, we still have some members of Congress who don't even like it, even though they don't have to vote on it. So I think it's a good plan. I think it's, as I said, it's the best we can do. It is not as good, perhaps, as a free trade agreement, but free trade agreements, I think, became so corrosive to our politics and so divisive and so polarizing. I don't think that was necessarily worth it. We do a lot of trade with New Zealand right now without a free trade agreement. We do a lot of trade in the U.S. with Vietnam without a free trade agreement, without the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So it doesn't mean there is no trade. It simply means some of the seamlessness of trade, some of the economic integration is less full than it might be with a free trade agreement. But, you know, when the U.S. did NAFTA in the 90s, there were perhaps a dozen or so free trade agreements globally. The last I looked, there are now about between 600 and 800 free trade agreements around the world. We have about 20. So we did go from leading the pack to being somewhat sidelined. The United States has an advantage or a privilege, one could argue, being such a large and dominant economy and such a desirable marketplace. We've been able to sit somewhat on the sidelines without a great penalty. And I'll just throw out one last thing. You know, the critics, because I dealt a lot with this about even the North American Free Trade Agreement, you know, some of our fiercest critics said, we lost 1 million jobs due to the North American Free Trade Agreement over 40 years. That is 25,000 jobs a year. In that period, we were creating 2 million jobs a year. So, but the problem again is where we lost them was highly painful, highly concentrated, and we really did not do right by the people who suffered.
Great. You have worked on transition teams, a couple of presidents' transition teams, both Clinton and Obama. We've just come through an election cycle ourselves. What was it like working on those transition teams, and what sort of lessons do you think are valuable for countries like ourselves to take from those?
Yeah, I was fortunate to serve on both President Clinton's and President Obama's transition team. And in fact, I will tell you, our election day is on a Tuesday. By the way, our election day is always on a Tuesday because it couldn't be on Sunday. That was church day. And Saturday was market day, so that's how, and you need a Monday to get to vote, so that's how it became on Tuesday. But when President Obama's election in 2008, I got a phone call Monday, midday, asking me to come down for the transition team, and I'm thinking, the election's tomorrow. What do you guys know that I don't know that you would like us to come down tomorrow? It's a little more recent. So the President Obama's transition team actually, a number of John Podesta and Mark Green, two people who've been in the Democratic Party for many years, compiled a 800-page book. I was asked to write a chapter on small business so that the incoming team would have an idea of what does each agency do, what was the last work that was done, what needs to be picked up. And then there was a whole process of actually going into each agency and interviewing both the political and the civil servants there so that there could be, for the American public, a more seamless transition, so to speak, to the next team so we could figure out what happened in those cases. So in many cases, it was very valuable. I mean, I have a completely unfounded anecdotal theory, but I will give you an example. When China was admitted into the World Trade Organization, And there was a lot of criticism, and that happened right at the end of the Clinton administration, the beginning of the Bush administration. And there's been criticism leveled that we did not enforce some of the rules that were put in place by China being admitted to the World Trade Organization and getting most favored nation treatment in terms of tariffs. I've always wondered whether part of that had to do with the transition. That in a transition, so many things are changing, it's very easy for something not to get done in that critical period. So I only say that I think those transition teams are critical, whether it's frankly in the private sector. You came into your company 4 years ago, and certainly in government, which has so many moving parts. And so those transitions were important, certainly with the Clinton administration, and certainly with President Obama's administration. And frankly, we prepared because we did not know who was going to win the election in 2016, because we began preparing a transition plan 3, 4 months before the election in 2016. I had one meeting with some of the Trump officials, but they basically ignored all that work that was done, because we prepared almost a 100-page book on the Export-Import Bank. Here are the key issues. Here are the key people in the bank. Here are some of the open issues that you're going to be confronting in the first few months. And much of that was really not paid attention to.
A real pity.
Yes.
We've spoken a little bit about, we've heard Warren Buffett's comment about betting against the US, and we had a brief chat about that yesterday. But you know, the growth in GDP in the US versus, say, the Eurozone has been really impressive. You know, the gap, which was effectively, there was no gap in 2008, that gap is now 80%. So the US has just continued to surge in growth, whereas the Eurozone has effectively stayed flat. And so Buffett has said, you know, he's just not prepared to bet against the US. What's your views on that? And why do you sense that the US has been so successful?
Well, some people say this is perhaps a little cheeky. You know, the US innovates and the EU regulates. And and sometimes we look to the EU to regulate because we have such a hard time regulating. Okay, we'll innovate, you create some regulations, then we can come around and do that. But I think that we have a very innovative economy. We have an economy that we do valorize entrepreneurship. We do, you know, if you look at contracts globally, they're often written in New York law because that is you can adjudicate a case rather quickly. Indra is not here. Not here today. I did a lot of business with India. Going through the Indian court system is something one does not want to look forward to. You rather might have root canal work than go through the Indian court system. So, not that ours is so perfect, but I think that when you look at other economies around the world, and I was fortunate as chairman of the Export-Import Bank, I visited 44 countries in my 8 years there. The U.S., I would say our government has the lightest footprint on the business and commercial sector than in almost any other country. Now, sometimes that's not to our advantage. I remember when we were doing some trade missions, there was criticism when Erdogan from Turkey went to Egypt and came with basically 2 plane loads full of executives. And the Egyptian government said, is this a sales call or a diplomatic mission? Our administrations tend to be a little much more hands-off, certainly Democratic ones, about bringing the business community along. So I think we could actually learn a little bit from other countries. You know, when Angela Merkel goes to China, she brings along 100 or so German business leaders to also make sales calls. So we could learn from that, but I think that the advantage we do have is we there is a little more of a tension between the business community and the government, and I think if we can keep that tension going in terms of, that actually is a healthy tension.
China. What's your thoughts on China?
You know, I remember, when you say that, Greg, I remember I was with President Obama in Tanzania at a state dinner, and there was beautiful china on the table. And I turned it over to look, and it was actually all made in China, which said something about our diplomacy there. You know, China is probably the most formidable and challenging country that we in the United States will be working with over the next 50 to 100 years and beyond. When I first got to the Export-Import Bank, we did not do that much business in China with the exception of an aircraft. And frankly, for a year or two, I ignored it because it was not something that I did a lot of work with. But however, it is such a dominant player globally, such a dominant player with trade and with the Belt and Road and so forth, that it cannot be ignored by any company or any country at their peril. I think in many ways they frankly have been a bad actor in terms of whether intellectual property, whether it comes to human rights. At the other hand, they have lifted more people out of poverty than any other country in the entire world has ever done. And I think that we're trying to find our footing. And I think I admire what President Biden is doing, because it is very tricky to navigate both the domestic politics in our country and globally, whether it has to do with climate, whether it has to do with what happened with COVID, and you know, we may have other health crises as we've had before. We've had others like SARS that were not as severe. We have issues around the South China Sea and Taiwan, issues around Ukraine, issues around Iran and oil. There are many currency. So we have to find places we can cooperate, we have to find places we can collaborate, and we have to find places we can compete. And that makes for a complicated relationship, because vis-a-vis the United States and, say, New Zealand, it's looking at ways, how do we cooperate better, how can we trade better? We don't have that same luxury with China. So I think that it takes enormous nimbleness and delicacy to manage that. And I agree with what Indra said, you know, we're not going to decouple. When we look at supply chains, we got caught in the United States and much of the world during the coronavirus, the COVID-19 crisis, because so much came from China, and we did not have enough diversification in supply chains that could balance some of those challenges. I think hopefully we've learned from that.
You mentioned briefly you're not probably as bullish as some others on India, and you've made the comment in terms of the legal system. What other thoughts do you have on India? You've heard it come up in discussion already this morning here.
Well, I would tell you, in my 8 years at the Export-Import Bank, I think we had 5 or 6 different Indian ambassadors to the United States. In that same period, Singapore had the same ambassador for over 20 years. The UAE has had the same ambassador for about 15 years. So there was a lot more stability in terms of understanding and having an interlocutor in terms of dealing with that country. I mean, first of all, India is an enormous country. So it is a complicated place to do business. Also, it has not as strong a central government, so that the doing business is very much province to province, state to state, which makes that more complicated. And India, I understand fully, and has a great dependency on Russia with oil and gas. We competed, the United States, to build some nuclear power plants in India, more than were built by Russia and China. So India has also had a much more of a stronger non-alignment that has made it, I think, more difficult for U.S. companies to operate there. And in many ways, it's also a new democracy. You know, it was in 1947. So in many ways, there are a number of those challenges that make it just a challenging place to do business. And at times, India has also applied some regulations and tax laws retroactively, which is a big challenge for a business when a new law is passed and will apply retroactively. So I think there are a number of those areas. I know that Prime Minister Modi has been much more keenly focused on that, but it's also just too big a market to ignore. But it is, someone once said this about Brazil, and I think it applies to India, it is no place for amateurs if you're doing business.
I think it's really good advice. Having been in and out 3 times with Walmart, we've certainly learnt that. We've got a question here from the floor, and maybe both of us will have a bit of a shot at this. The PM talked about focusing on execution without losing unique Kiwi charm and values. So what traits should Kiwis hold on to in terms of, Americans and business value?
Charm goes a long way. Charm goes a long way. And I think that, and integrity goes a long way. If people can rely on your word, if you're going to deliver a product or a service or a contract on time, and you can do that, and if you can't, to be straightforward and upright and upfront about that, it goes a long way to cementing business relationships.
Yeah, the bit that I would add is on top of that sort of Kiwi charm and values, which I think is 100% right, is some of these countries, whether it's America or China, are incredibly large. You made the comment about India, and whilst New Zealand actually does have a reasonably significant land mass, the population is reasonably sparse compared to most other countries, and I often have seen businesses want to go to America, and possibly instead of picking a tight geographic area and going deep and hard in that area, there's often a perception that, well, I'll tell you what, I'll open up on the East Coast, I'll open up on the West Coast, why don't we go down to Florida? And then all of a sudden the tyranny of distance, the complexity of multiple states, of different regulations starts to add a complexity in your business. You can't grow market share, you don't get any dominance. So I've seen the same thing play out in China with businesses trying to open there. Usually picking an area and going in deep and hard, applying all the values that we know are important around sort of truth and honesty and being unvarnished and doing what you say you will do. If you stick to that, you're off to a reasonable start.
You know, Greg, as you said that, I was thinking there's a famous Peter Drucker quote that he says, culture eats strategy for breakfast. And from what I have seen here is there is a strong culture, there's a strong sense of pride, there's a strong sense of quality in terms of products, dairy products and so forth, that goes a long way on global markets.
Yeah, I agree. Last question that I have for you. One of the things that has come up is a comment today about productivity, and we have to improve productivity. What are your thoughts on that? And, you know, how have you seen that play out in different economies and countries?
I have 2 thoughts on that. I would tell you, when I chaired the Export-Import Bank, we would calculate with our Department of Labor how many jobs we created for every $1 billion worth of exports. And when I got to the Export-Import Bank, it was about 7,300 jobs for every $1 billion worth of exports. By the time I left 8 years later, it was about 5,200. So there was great productivity, particularly in the manufacturing side, where you can measure it much more keenly, and you can measure it in Air New Zealand. And I remember actually, we did a lot of aircraft financing at XM, and we would look at how many employees per aircraft, a key measurement, And in some countries, I think in Egypt, it was something like over 100 per aircraft. I mean, it was a staggering number, and it was not a surprise that they became places for a great job, not necessarily a great airline. The other challenge is as we become more and more of a service economy, it's very hard to measure productivity. It's hard to measure productivity of education. It's hard to measure, and certainly not in the short term. It's hard to measure productivity in health outcomes. You know, if due to new medications and drugs, maybe a hospital stay is limited to 1 day versus 3 or 4 days, there's a great productivity gain, not very easy to measure. And if you can keep someone out of the hospital entirely because they're taking some drug on a regular basis, take my 81 milligrams of aspirin every day, as one example, there are great productivity gains, hard to measure. So you can measure, I think, productivity well in goods and in some services like in the airline industry, but it's not that easy to measure. So I think it's important, but I don't think we should get too hung up on it.
I think that's great advice. I can't let you go without taking this last question that's come through on the screen about polarisation in US politics in the last 10 years. Tended to have gotten worse and worse. So how about the last word on how you're feeling about that?
I will tell you something that Eric Cantor told me recently. Eric Cantor had been the number 2 person in the Republican leadership in the House and lost his primary to a Tea Party person who only served for 1 or 2 terms. And not surprising, Eric said this to me, but I have not forgotten it. He said, one way we reduce polarization in our country is to change our primary system. Part of the problem is maybe 10% of Americans, 12% in a good year, vote in the primary, which tends to be the most fervent people on the far left and the far right. And so, particularly in our lower house in Congress, members worry about mostly a challenge from their own party. And so if we actually got more people to vote in primaries, we might actually have a broader spectrum of people and less polarization. The other thing that people talk about, it has a terrible name, ranked choice voting. Essentially, it's an instant runoff. You have 4 people running, you have to rank people, your first, second, third, and fourth choice, so you don't have a runoff. It tends to make people not try and take such a sharp-edged, sharp-elbowed, because if I am so mean to my opponents, I will not get anyone to make. I want to be, if I'm not your first choice, I want to be your second choice. So there are things like that are being talked about in our country, how we can change the primary system, how we change vote by mail, how we can get more people to participate. But we need to find a way to arrest this. Some of this has actually happened with social media, but we need to find remedies to that, to turn that around, because it's not good for our democracy.
Thank you. Fred Hochberg, thank you so much for coming to New Zealand. Thanks for joining me on stage and sharing your thoughts with everyone here. Much appreciated.
Thanks, everyone.